I don't think that the Caucasians, let's say, should revert to being white. I think that's a bad idea. It's a dangerous idea.
With the people in Europe who are turning to a regressive nationalism as an alternative to the current state of chaos.
It's been just over 2 years now since he first appeared on the scene.
I also said I wouldn't mouth the words of the ideologically possessed, and that was with regards to gender-neutral pronouns.
At first, everyone thought he was just a brave university professor who had had enough of the cultural Marxist garbage that has taken over our society. That he'd snapped when the Canadian government announced it was going to legally mandate calling people Zim, Zer, and Z-self. Peterson came out of the gate with some vicious rebukes of the political left, and even called them what they are, cultural Marxists. But it didn't take long for Peterson to begin showing his true colors. Nearly at the same time he was thrust into the spotlight for defying the social justice clique at the University of Toronto, Peterson began positioning himself to evangelize a very specific demographic: young white males. What followed after fall of 2016 was a meteoric rise to fame at the hands of the mainstream media, which they made every effort to disguise as being organic. Soon thereafter, his mission became plain to see. One of Peterson's most substantial achievements has been the instantiation in the minds of his followers the belief that Europeans working together to resist their collective dispossession and extermination is no different than Marxist identity politics. Any concerted effort made by whites as a group to resist dispossession by progressive government policies or by mass immigration is condemned by Peterson as being a manifestation of identity politics.
The French intellectuals had to admit that communism was a bad deal by the end of the 1960s. And what happened was that they played a sleight of hand game in some sense and rebranded themselves under the postmodern guise. And that's where identity politics came from.
According to Peterson, identity politics are when a group identifies itself as being oppressed by another group and demands that the group that is oppressing them give up their wealth and power for redistribution amongst the oppressed group.
And so they started to play a sleight of hand, and instead of pitting the proletariat, the working class, against the bourgeoisie, they started to pit the oppressed against the oppressor. And that opened up the avenue to identifying any number of groups as oppressed and oppressor, and to continue the same narrative under a different name.
Some may believe that when Peterson claims whites are playing identity politics, he is in fact describing any form of politics that aims to advance the interests of European people as a group. However, in reality, Peterson has in fact tried to construct a narrative in which whites are literally trying to define an oppressed-oppressor dichotomy to pursue Marxist identity politics. In the spring of 2018, Peterson published a short article on his blog entitled "On the So-Called Jewish Question." In that article, he wrote, "Why do the reactionary conspiracy theorists even bother? This is a straightforward matter. If you're misguided enough to play identity politics, whether on the left or the right, you require a victim, in the right-wing case, European culture or some variant, and a perpetrator, Jews. Otherwise, you can't play the game." So whenever Peterson dismisses and condemns Europeans as playing toxic identity politics for working together to put an end to mass immigration that is rendering them a minority in their own countries, or for working together to put an end to the Marxist subversion of their nations that is hell-bent on incrementally dispossessing them, he is in fact making the claim that those Europeans want nothing more than to play the victim and demand redistribution of power from Jews to themselves. It is with this sleight of hand that Peterson falsely equates whites wanting to protect the demographic destiny of their own countries with totalitarianism, evil, and danger. Peterson's fallacy here is plainly revealed when one considers the fact that both the USA and Canada, both before World War II, were classical liberal democracies that shed blood to defeat totalitarian regimes, and both countries strictly enforced the demographic character of their countries with immigration laws that nearly exclusively permitted European immigration only. Furthermore, when Peterson differentiates between men and women, it is no different than someone differentiating between races. It is a form of identity politics that is based on objective biological reality, rather than any kind of ideology, and is thus the antithesis of Marxist class warfare identity politics. Having established that whites protecting their nations and the future of their children from certain destruction is automatically tantamount to the instantiation of some flavor of totalitarian regime, Peterson's next objective was to undermine the psychological foundations of European identity itself. Stratagem: psychopathologize and deconstruct white identity. Peterson frequently uses his position of authority as a psychologist to psychopathologize white identity. More than once, he has referred to whites who desire to organize together to protect their group interests as pathological. At other times, he likes to chastise whites for committing the sin of racial pride, deeming it as well to be a pathology. During a talk, Peterson was confronted with a quote from Canadian historical sociologist and professor at the University of New Brunswick, Ricardo Duchesne. In the quote, Duchesne argued that for the underlying spirit of individualism to be preserved in the West, European people themselves must be preserved, arguing that individualism was a trait that seemed to be inherent to European peoples, concluding that Europeans must therefore take pride in their ethnic identity and heritage as a means of self-preservation, and therefore as a means of preserving the spirit of individualism itself. Rather than addressing the actual premises and conclusion of Duchesne's argument, Peterson went on a tirade about how ethnic pride is sinful and unacceptable, casting scorn upon Duchesne and other whites who dare to take pride in their heritage and culture.
That's nothing to be proud of. That's something to tremble before, to take on as an ethical burden, and not to wave a flag for how wonderful you are that you happen to have the same skin color as some of the people who thought that up. It's not the right response.
Peterson's chastisement of Europeans who take pride in their heritage and culture is based on the absurd assumption that any who do so are trying to literally take personal credit for the achievements of their ancestors.
It's like I don't feel pride about that. I feel like I have something to live up to. That's not the same thing, man. And so these right-wingers in this, it's like, look what we've done. It's like, no, it's not you that did that. That's something, man. You gotta have your act together before you would dare to say, well, that was me. It's like, yeah, sure it was you. Yeah, right. No.
The reality, of course, is that pride in one's heritage, culture, and civilization is not in fact hubristic pride, but one of pride of ownership, an emotion that engenders the very deep sense of responsibility and appreciation that is necessary to preserve those things, the very feelings that Peterson claims should be felt in place of pride. At some point, Peterson declared that the goal of what he calls the radical right, his disparaging term for European people who wish to cooperate with one another to protect their nations from certain destruction, is to cultivate unearned identity and the glories of the past. What Peterson is doing here is in fact paving the way for the most extreme forms of egalitarianism, since one cannot control their DNA or their heritage, nor can one control their environment. The person one is cannot be earned. This is the same argument that is used by those who argue for equality of outcome. For example, they will argue that since intelligence is either largely determined by genetics or the environment, it is an advantage that is not earned, and therefore measures must be put in place to mitigate that unfair, unearned advantage. What Peterson is actually saying is that whites have no right to their own identity based on their heritage, since they did not work to earn who their parents or ancestors were.
You're using your unearned
privilege. Peterson wanted to say unearned privilege, referring of course to white privilege, but realized his error and began racking his brain for a synonym.
The unearned gift that's been granted to you as a source of personal pride in your accomplishments due to your skin. It's like, no, not good, not a good argument.
Just as the cultural Marxists do, Peterson likes to deconstruct the white race down to nothing more than the level of melanin in one's skin.
The other thing about the whole angry young white men thing is that my angry young white men followers are a hell of a lot less angry and a hell of a lot less white than they would have been if they wouldn't have been following me. Because one of the things, I've had many letters from young men who've also said that they had been attracted to the more dogmatic end of the more dogmatic right-wing end of the political spectrum, and that listening to my videos has been exactly what's kept them more or less in the middle.
Deconstructing whiteness, as the cultural Marxists call it, is something that Peterson loves to do at every opportunity.
My concern is doing away with whiteness. If you abolish slavery, you abolish slaveholders. In the same way, if you abolish racial oppression, you do away with whiteness. Whiteness is an identity that arises entirely out of oppression. Whiteness is not a culture, it's not a religion, it's not a language, it's simply an oppressive social category.
In a tweet to evolutionary psychologist Kevin MacDonald in late 2017, Peterson posed the classic cultural Marxist question, how do you define white?
Who's white exactly? Like, how do you draw these distinctions?
Even going so far as to make the absurd declaration that biological organisms do not have an interest in the propagation of their DNA into the future. While some may try to argue that Peterson's primary concern is with trying to prevent society from being destabilized by what he calls tribalism or identity politics, it is clear that when it comes to Europeans, Peterson's motives go far beyond simply warning about the dangers of group identity. He has declared that white identity itself is a mental illness, and not only that, but that the white race itself is a fiction, just as the cultural Marxists do, the people whom he claims to oppose. The very hint of a white individual taking pride in their heritage causes Peterson to lapse into a venomous tirade of shaming and castigation. All of this is fueled by his profound fear that if whites unite in solidarity to protect themselves and the future of their children, it will somehow lead to the total destruction of Western civilization.
I think it's genocidal in its ultimate expression. I think it will bring down our civilization if we pursue it.